Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Art 195, 3D Modeling for Animation, the spring semester 2022. Where we left off last Wednesday is we completed modeling our Reboot character Mike. And what I want to focus on today is to finalize the surfacing of him. We're going to do some of the easy ones first, which are the chrome and the gold and that sort of thing. And then we're going to focus on the face. Now, I have provided the images for you, but there's different kinds of mapping that you can do. There are procedurals or gradient maps. There are UV maps. What we will be doing for his face is an image map. So for those of you who have no experience in Photoshop, I have provided those files for you, and they are on our shared Google Drive folder. Okay, so without further ado, let's get going here. So what I've done is I sent my model over to layout and made sure that I saved the layout as a separate file, and that goes in my layout folder. Then what I need to do in addition to that is right now I'm going to open up the surface editor. And if you don't know where that is, it is over here to the left under scene editor. Okay. And when you open it up, as I was creating those placeholders, you'll notice that they appear over here to the left of my surface editor. I have the black surface, I have the chrome, I have the face, which we have not added yet, but it is the green or bluish surface. We have the chrome, I already said chrome, the gold surface, the ground that we'll work on, and the red surface. So let's work on the easy ones first. Let's start with the black. And I think I'm going to turn smoothing on. I really don't think I need to change anything else. It could be, if you want it to be a little bit reflective, we could do that. We could change the specular highlights. Right now they're set to 50. We could adjust the roughness. These settings here allow us to change the properties of the surface. Okay. Now we will be doing it a little bit differently for his face. Right now, I'm using the BSDF surfaces. Now for the gold and for the chrome, the easiest way to do that, and there are some good material settings for those. And what I want to do is right over here where it says scene editor, surface editor, right below surface editor presets. I'm going to bring that up. Okay. And then what I'm going to do on the tab to the right is tab to the left, is I want to bring up the built-in surfaces. And what we want to do first is go to metal. And they have a lot of different metal surfaces. Now we can select gold, there's brush gold, there's copper, there's brass. Brass, the appearance of brass is very similar to the gold. So I'm going to select gold first. And to do that, I need to make sure over here is that I have the gold surface selected. Now I can double click on the gold surface and it will load those settings into my gold surface here. Notice that it changes it pretty dramatically. Now, what I want to do next though, because it really doesn't look very it doesn't look spectacular, to be quite honest. That's because the default settings when you open up a file in layout are set to textured shaded solid. If you want to see what it's going to look like when it's rendered, then switch to VPR. And notice that what we see now is we see the effects of the lights. We see the effect, which are twofold. If I look at lights, you're going to see that we have our environment light, and we also have the distant light, which is the default light and light wave. So that's not looking half bad, but I'm going to, notice that it smooths some of the roughness out. you were, before we saw some of the facets, and I'm just looking at the gold, but this will change in a minute for the chrome as well. Okay, and we're going to change that for the red for his boots and for his gloves. So the next one is I want to select the chrome, and let's scroll, and here's the chrome surface, and it's a good one. So I'm going to make sure that chrome is selected here. I'm going to double click here. It will load those settings. And you can see it is, those properties look really good. It's reflecting the existing environment. Okay, so we're nearly done. What I want to do though is I'm going to select the red, and I just want to turn on smoothing. That's all, so I don't see any of the facets. And it's already set to subpatches or meta NURBS anyway. So it doesn't really alter anything that much. Okay, so we've got everything looking pretty good. Okay, now typically what is done today is that what we use is called the node editor. So for example, if I were to select the face, and we have, it's currently set to BSDF, and I edit in the node editor, I'm going to close these surfaces now because now we're going to customize these others. Click here, and you can see that it is a graph, and these can get quite complicated. So right now we have material to material. Okay, what I can do over to the left is I can plug in all sorts of modifiers that will change this surface. We will use the node editor later in the semester, but for right now, I'm going to go back to an old school way of doing it, and they both work just fine. So this might, for those of you who are familiar with Photoshop, to be able to do his face, this might make more sense to you at the moment. So what I'm going to do, instead of principled BSDF, I'm going to use a standard. When I do that, it automatically switches to a gray color. So I'm going to go back and click in here, and I'm going to select that light blue once again. Boom. Now what I can also do is I can affect its luminosity if I want. Now watch what happens when I crank that up. Notice how bright it gets, like the screen of a CRT cathode ray tube. So maybe I want maybe a good 10%, 15%. I don't want to crank it all the way up, but that's pretty much what I did for the lampshade. Okay, and if I can't, I have trouble with that, hit 15. And that looks pretty good. Okay, do we want specular highlights for that? Right now it's set to 5%, glossiness, reflectivity. Okay, these other surfaces already have those properties, but back in the day, you had all of these settings over here that you could use. We could add a reflection map to this. We can also add transparency, translucency to any of these properties, and a bump map. Okay, and we added a bump map when we were designing the table and lamp, and I added a bump map to the base of the lamp. So these are all really good ways of doing that. We can also turn on smoothing if we want. That's not a bad idea for the face. But now what I want to do is I want to project an image onto this surface. So to do that, I'm going to hit the key next to the color. Now, if I wanted to animate the surface, we would select E for these, and that stands for envelope. So I just want to apply a surface to this. So by default, it selects image map, but you can see we can use procedural or gradient maps as well. I just want to use an image map right now. Then I have to decide what kind of projection do I want? Do I want it planar? Do I want it cylindrical? Do I want it spherical, cubic, front, UV, for right now, planar is fine because while it's not an exact flat plane, it is as close to a plane as you're going to get. Okay. Then by default, since I created the object with the Z-axis front, I'm going to leave that selected. I'm just going to leave repeat done, and the same with pixel blending. The size of the projection, I'm going to leave all of those intact until I bring in my image. So what I want to do, and I hope I have these here, since I'm in a different place right now, I'm going to load the image, and I'm going to go back to my image folder. And I should have, let's see if I have it. Oh, please. And the sandbar image. Let me go back to my desktop. That's something that I didn't prepare for. And I'm going to look in content fall 2020, and hopefully I put it in there. And let's look not at objects. Let's look in images. Do I have it? Yeah, I do. I have Mike's eyes as a Photoshop file, and I have Mike's eyes as a mask, and I have Mike's eyes as a JPEG. I will come back to that to show you how I created those. But I started by default with a Photoshop file that has an image. Let's look at this as a, there we go. Yeah, list, okay. And I'm going to select the Mike's eyes here, the JPEG. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and load that first. And it takes JPEGs, and it will take Photoshop files now. Traditionally, it took TGA files. Okay, now it doesn't match. So what I can do next is I can go ahead and I can select automatic sizing. But notice what happened when I did that. It lost the blue background. So what I had done is I had created a mask, which is identical to what you're seeing here, but without the little highlights for the eyes. Okay. And what that's going to do, for those of you familiar with Photoshop, is we're going to use that as a stencil to cut out the background and allow the blue screen to show through. Okay. So to do that, I need to take over here in my texture editor, and I need to take the current layer and I need to copy it. Before I do, though, I want to make sure that I want to reset, because by default, when you bring image maps in, they tile. This isn't a problem because I had a much larger image than what I needed, but just to be on the safe side, it pays to go ahead and do that if you want a single image to be reflected or projected onto the surface. Now, let me show you also, before we go ahead and cut that out, what it looks like if I projected along the x-axis. So anytime you project along an axis and it doesn't make sense to you, click through these until you get the right one. Now, notice that because he was built from front to back, that this is projected along the z-axis. If I wanted it projected from the top to the bottom, I would probably use the y-axis. If I wanted it projected left to right, then that would be on the x-axis. But depending on how your model was built will determine which axis you use. Okay, so far so good. So now what I can do is I can select this layer. I'm going to copy the current layer because I want to make sure that all the current settings are copied with this. I'm not going to use the image again, but I want to copy the settings so that it's projected along the Z-axis. And I especially have all the scale and position settings in here. Very important, because if they don't match, especially when you're using a mask, that they won't line up properly and you're not going to get the results that you had hoped for. So now what I can do is I can go ahead and I can paste, and I don't want to replace, I want to add 2 layers, and it will just paste the same thing onto the top. Now what I can do is I can go to, and I can switch, and I can go from Mike's Eyes JPEG and load the one that I created for a mask. Well, it should go back to the same folder here. So here's Mike's Eyes mask. And I'll open that. And you can see that it loaded it in the normal state and that the little highlights on his eyes are missing. So now what I can do is I can switch from viewing it in a normal mode to come over to the, where are we? To the blending mode to the top right here. And I can select alpha. That's what I want. Now, when you see this happen, you notice that the blue is showing through, but the eyes went away. So if that happens to you, that just the opposite of what you would like to happen, then what you need to do here is click invert layer. And now I have his face and I have the background that I created. Okay, pretty cool. So far, so good. We have him just about done. But now what I want to do is I want to integrate him with a background image. Okay, so let's do that. That's the next step that we want. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close the texture editor. And I'm going to close this one. I may need to go back and make some changes, but so far, so good. So now what I want to do is I want to bring in a background that affects this. And then at the same time, make sure for some of these. So actually, I'm going to bring the surface editor back up for a minute. And what I want to do, for example, for the gold, well, I'll come back to it. But for the gold and for the chrome, because they are reflective surfaces, what you want to do is we're going to go to the shading model, and we're going to bring in a reflection map. So even though we have nothing else created here for an environment, and we will have the background environment, it will, by default, will not be reflected in the reflective surfaces. So we need to create an artificial environment for it to work. So let me go ahead and close that like I had done before. And now what I want to do is I need to move this a little bit. And I need to go to render. And under render, I want to look at the backdrop. And here are our effects. Right now, it says add environment. We may need to do that. I'm going to leave this as backdrop right now. If I double click on this, it's going to show me that we have the blue sky and we have the gray ground. Okay, so the sky color is white, zenith color is blue. All of these can be changed, or we can ignore them altogether. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to select composite. And this is where I'm going to add a background. We can use a background color, and if I turn that on, notice that it uses black. For many of my renderings, I like, if I want to showcase the object, I use a black background. Okay, and it's still using the environment so that all of the reflections and all of the properties that you would see with a gradient background or outdoor environment still exist. But instead, I want to bring in a background image. So I've already used one before. I'm going to load the image. And again, this needs to be, you can use whatever image you want. I happen to select this wasn't the river image. I use the sandbar. That's the one that I use every semester because, to be quite honest, it's easy to add it. Okay, so let's bring that in. And you can see that he's now standing in a river. But what I need to do is I want to match. I need to move him over. So I'm going to move him over, and I'm going to move the plane over because I'm going to use the plane to cast the shadow. Right now it's casting a shadow on the plane, but I want the plane to disappear. So I'm going to select the reboot character. So let's make sure that objects are selected. And I have the reboot layer 2. And I'm going to select T for move. And I'm going to move it not along the Y, but along the X axis. Come on. Whoop, undo. You know, when that happens, it's slowing down. So I'm going to go to, instead of VPR, I'm going to switch to back to textured shaded solid. And now I'm going to go ahead and it will allow me to speed up the computer a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and change the X a little bit. Notice how it moves really nicely now. And I'm just moving it over. I may want to tilt it a little bit to make sure that both the background, the ground plane and the reboot character match the perspective. So to do that, I'm going to select Y for rotate. And I can adjust the pitch for this. Not too much, just a little bit. So it looks like he's standing in the background. Okay. So what do we do next? I need to make sure that I display a shadow, but I get rid of the ground plane. Now you need a ground plane to be able to do this. So I'm going to switch back to VPR. And now what I want to do is I'm going to bring up the surface editor back up. And this is where I'm going to make some of my refined changes here. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the surface editor. And let's select the ground plane. I don't need to change the color or anything, not at all. What I want to do is under shading mode, where it says photo real, what I want to do is I want to select something called shadow catcher. This is really cool because what it will do is it will display the shadow onto the background, or what will appear to be the background, but in effect, it's displaying it on using the ground plane for us to do that. So as soon as I select that, okay, notice what happens. So I probably want to move my character back a little bit in space because he's kind of going off the image. There is a way that we can match the character to the background photograph, and we can also match the perspective of the background as well. I have a really good video tutorial available in my Lightwave, my Lightwave playlist, and it should be at the very bottom. And that's something that we may be able to cover on another day. So now I'll make sure that he is selected again, and I'm going to move him back a little bit. We don't know his size, so we can make him bigger, smaller. When you guys are doing the finished part of your assignment, I want to make sure that your reboot character is large and dominates the scene. It doesn't need to be small, it needs to be fairly large. So I'm going to go back to T for move again. And I'm going to move him along the Z-axis now. And I better switch from VPR back to texture shaded solid. Okay, now along the Z-axis, I can move him back a little bit. And if I need to enlarge him, I can. And if I need to move him over, I can. So I'll go ahead and I'm using the spinners over to the left here. Make sure his shadow is complete. Probably one of the other things that I want to do too, well, I'll switch back to VPR here. There you go. So notice that he's being reflected in here. I don't want the ground plane to be a reflective surface. So I'm going to go back over here. And where it says specular highlights and roughness, I can change the roughness. I can also change the specular highlights so that they're none. And notice that that reflection goes away. Okay, but what I also want to do is let's select gold and let's go back over to shading model. And I want it to be able to reflect as if it were actually in that photograph, that environment. So what I'm going to do down here where it says reflection, right now it's by default, it's set to ray trace. So anything in that environment will be reflected, but because there isn't anything in that environment, the background doesn't count as a part of that. I'm going to switch. I'm going to go from ray trace to ray trace and spherical map. So it will reflect part of his body, especially his joints and that sort of thing, but it will also ray trace the background. So I need to add the image. We already have the sandbar image. And now you'll notice instead of just the reflections that you see, part of his boot in here and part of his joints and stuff in the chrome, that it's also reflecting the background as well. So it looks like he's really placed in them. This is done in video games. It's done in film. It's done in all kinds of things. Okay, where you combine live action with CG, where you create composites. Now I'm going to do the same for the. I did that for the gold, and I'm going to do that for the chrome as well. Let's go back here, and it's set to ray trace. And I want it to be spherical map and ray trace. We're going to select the sandbar image. There we go. Okay. Now the chrome or the gold looks pretty good to me. If I wanted it a really shiny chrome, I would have to go back in and I would have to make some significant adjustments. But I'm pretty happy with it as is. The same with his boots. I like that they are shiny and a little bit reflective, but they don't overpower the piece at all. So really, we're pretty much done with this, except for the rendering of it. And that's what I wanted to cover on Wednesday, so that we set up our camera settings properly. We make sure that it's rendered at a fairly high resolution. Maybe do a few test renders first to make sure that everything is okay. But I might turn him a little bit more now that I'm looking at it. Oh, there is one other thing that I almost forgot about. Notice how crisp the shadow is. Even though it's cast by the sun, and the sun does cast a very harsh shadow, it would not be that crisp. So what I need to do is I need to go to lights. And you can see that we have two lights. We have the light and we have the environmental light. We're going to leave the environmental light alone. But with the light selected, I'm going to click properties. Now, what I could do is I could change this from a distant light to an area light, and look at how it significantly changes the properties of our model. I could change it to linear light. Doesn't look all that different, except the shadow is starting to look pretty different. Notice that all these different lights that we have available to us. I'm going to leave it the distant light. And something that they've made available to us that wasn't available before is that if we change the angle of this, we can soften the shadow. So I'm going to crank this up a little bit. And as I do that, notice that the shadow gets a little bit softer. Went from, just a couple of degrees to a bit more. And this looks pretty much more like it would actually appear in the real world. So the next thing that I want to do is we'll call it a day, or I'll say I'm done with this, but I want to show you how I arrived in Photoshop with his face. So that for those of you familiar with Photoshop, you'll be able to create other projection maps on your own. This is done all the time, and that's what I'm going to start next week. We'll probably have a shortened meeting on Wednesday so that you guys can finish this up. The rendering settings will not take that long. But I'm going to start from scratch and show you how to take just a simple box and add transparent maps, reflection maps, all sorts of things to be able to turn it into something way more spectacular than just a simple cube. Okay, so with complex surfacing techniques, you can create a whole variety of things, a whole slew of things. So I'm going to go back to objects. And just this one more thing. I want to make sure that I have the character selected, and I'm going to select Y for rotate. And I'm going to, again, use the spinner and turn off VPR real quick. And I'm going to change the heading so he's facing a little bit different. Now, I'm kind of picky about this. The reason I'm having him turn a little bit is because when you view an object from a 3/4 view, a 3/5 view, something like that, this might be a little bit better. And also tilt it down a little bit. So I'm going to change the pitch a little bit. So it looks like he's standing on the ground plane. Now, there is a tool that enables you to match the perspective of the grid. And that's what the okie doke. Pretty much the way I want it. I'm going to switch back to, it says my internet connection is unstable. That's not good. There you go. So it looks like the angle looks approximately like he's standing there. We have a distant light that we've used. I can also change, notice how bright and shiny everything looks. If I were to change the volumetric distance, let's crank that way up to 100 meters and see what that looks like. And because it is the sun, you're really not going to see much of a difference, to be quite honest, because the sun is this huge, big ball of light that, as I said, to be able to change the direction of the sun, you only need to rotate it to get a difference in shadows. You don't need to change the size of it. You don't need to change anything else about it. So I'm going to go back to 1 meter. It really doesn't matter. That was the default setting for it. So I'm going to call it a day for this. But before I do, because I want to go to Photoshop and show you how to create the face, I'm going to go over here to save. And I want to save scene as. And I think I already saved it in here. Yeah, I'm using a different folder. And this is not a good practice, just to let you know. So I'm going to come back to art. Oh, come on. Content, yeah, 2021. I'm going to put, because that's where I saved the last one and saved it in scenes. Yeah, reboot. Well, no, maybe I changed it. Let's go back to the desktop again. And look at the content. Pretty sure I used this one. Maybe it was scenes 2. Scenes. No, that's different. So I'm going to go ahead and just save it in there. Maybe I didn't save it. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the content fall 2021, even though we're in 2022. Save it in scenes. And name it Reboot Spring 2022. I'm going to save it. After that, you're going to also want to make sure that all of your objects have been updated. So you're going to want to go to File, Save. You can either say Save All Objects, or you can say Save All. So I'll just say Save All Objects since we just saved the scene. Okay, now I can close it out before I render it. But I don't want you sending me this file. I don't want you sending me this layout file. Wait until I've shown you on Wednesday how I want this rendered. And then you will send me a final rendered file of it. Okay. So I'm going to quit Lightwave for all of you now. And then I'm going to open up Photoshop to show you how I created his face. And then we're going to call it a day. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and quit Lightwave. And I'm going to quit Layout, or Modeler rather. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up Photoshop. When you're creating your own image maps, it's important that they always be square. You know, if you make them 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, you're in pretty good shape. You can go as large as maybe 2,000 by 2,000 pixels. But they have to start off square. And as I said, that by default, they will automatically tile. And then if it needs to change and be different, then you'll need to do that. You need to change the proportions of it when you project it. I'm going to go ahead and open. And I want to go to my desktop. And I need to go back into my folder here, Content 2021. And I need to open Mike's Eyes. There we go, PSD file. So here we have some of the layers turned on, some of them turned off. Notice that I created this, and let's see the size here. I'm going to go to image size. Okay. And instead of looking at this in inches, I'm going to switch to pixels. I made it 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. Now it need only be 72 pixels per inch. That's the upside to this. Okay. Then, because this is a very simple, it can be a photograph if you wish. You can project photographs, and that's done all the time. That if you look at my virtual gallery, the wooden floor is a projection of that, just a photograph of a wood floor and then tiled. That's a good example of using an image to create the illusion of a surface that looks very real. But because this is a flat two-dimensional graphic image. I chose in Photoshop to use over here. I chose to use the ellipse tool, and I created shapes. And I also used the pen tool to create the shape for his eyebrows. Okay. Then I put each one, because every time you create a separate shape, they're on separate layers. You can see that I have left eye, the right eye, each of them as separate shapes on separate layers on a white background. It can be a colored background. It doesn't have to be white. And then I saved this. I saved it first as a Photoshop file. And then to make it compatible with Lightwave, I exported it. So I saved each version a little bit differently. So I could do a file, save as. It's probably easier if you save it as a JPEG now, but I'll show you the old way of saving this. Is that I don't want to, I already saved it first as a Photoshop file, but if I, it's not going to allow me to save it as a TGA file anymore. That's weird. Okay, so instead, I guess they've made some changes here to the most recent iteration of Photoshop. I'm going to go instead and go to File, and I'm going to go to Export, and I'm going to go to Save for Web Legacy. And I want to make sure I don't select GIF, but I select JPEG. Make sure that I select high quality. Okay, so that it's optimized, it's high quality. If you want, it can be very high, but because it's flat, two-dimensional graphic, it doesn't need to be any higher. And click Save, and save it next to your Photoshop file. So that's where I got my initial projected image. But then what I wanted to do is that I needed to create that mask for it while leaving everything else intact. And using layers, I turned off the highlights for his eyes. And I did the same thing. I went to File, Export, Save for Web Legacy, and again, saved it as a JPEG file. So this is the one that I changed to alpha afterwards. Okay, so that it functioned like a cookie cutter, allowing only to either let either the background or the foreground of this show through. And if it's the opposite of what you want, then just select inverse mask. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show you today. Now, later on this semester, we will be working with UV maps, and they can become quite complex. These can be very complex too. And in the next series of demonstrations that I do, starting next week, you will see that we can take, as I mentioned earlier in my webinar this morning, that we can take a very simple cube and create something really quite spectacular with it. I mean, it's just using just simple geometry, but complex surface mapping. Okay. So that's it for today. Let's see who else is here. Brenda's here. Okay. Okie doke. So if there aren't any questions, if there are, I'm going to bring up the chat here. Please ask them now, and I can review anything for you. As I said, I made these images available for you on Google Drive, in our shared Google Drive folder. And it should be, well, let's see if I can't find it here. Here's our Google Drive folder. Let's look at Art 195, the Spring 22, and ancillary files. If I double click on there, here's Mike's eyes in here. Notice that I made available to you the Photoshop file that has all the layers. I also included the mask, and I included the projection image that you'll use for his face. Now, if you wish to use another, create your own image and experiment with that, I encourage you to do so. But remember that Photoshop is not a required prerequisite for the class. So that's why I've made this available for all of you. Okay. Well, if that's it, all of you are free to leave. And I will see you on Wednesday, and we'll do the final rendering of this. Okay, bye-bye.